Everyone in that ballroom thought they knew exactly what was about to happen, and every single one of them was wrong, including the man who had spent 43 years building the empire he was preparing to give away. I was standing between two women I barely knew, Gretchen Vale, my father-in-law's personal attorney, whose perfume smelled like something between amber resin and quiet menace, and Dvorka Simic, the head of mergers at Brannick and Simic, who had flown in from Ljubljana specifically for this announcement. Neither of them knew I existed in any meaningful way. I was just the wife, the decorative fixture, the woman who had married into the family and smiled at the right moments and said nothing sharp enough to leave a mark. My name is Thessaly, and I had been waiting for this night for 22 months. The ballroom of the Keswick Lord Hotel had been rented for this purpose alone. 140 guests in formal attire. A string quartet playing something that sounded like Satie but wasn't quite, 3 open bars, and a centerpiece made of white orchids so pale they looked carved from soap. My husband, Orvin Brannick, eldest son, presumptive heir, the man his father had groomed for this exact moment since he was 11 years old, stood 3 feet to my left, champagne glass in hand, jaw set in the particular way it got when he was working hard to appear calm. He was not calm. He hadn't been calm for weeks, neither had I, but for entirely different reasons. The clock above the marble fireplace read 11:59 and 43 seconds. Crispin Brannick, patriarch, founder of Brannick Vale Holdings, a man who wore his authority the way other men wore skin, stepped onto the small raised platform at the center of the room. He was 71 years old and looked 60. He had the kind of face that had never quite learned how to be uncertain. He raised his champagne flute. The room fell silent with the practiced obedience of people who understood which silences cost them nothing and which ones might cost them everything. "Before the new year arrives," he said, "I have one announcement to make." I felt Orvin's hand find mine in the dark periphery between our bodies. He squeezed, not tenderly, with the grip of someone holding on to a railing above a very long drop. "At the stroke of midnight," Crispin Brannick said, "I am handing the company to my son." The room erupted. Applause, laughter, the kind of noise that crowds make when they believe something historic is happening and want to be witnessed believing it. Gretchen Vale touched her collarbone. Dvorka Simic raised her glass toward Orvin. The string quartet stopped Satie adjacent and shifted into something approximating triumph. 17 seconds. I opened my phone, not to check the time, not because I was nervous or distracted. I opened my phone because I had an email waiting in my drafts folder that I had written 9 days earlier and scheduled to send at precisely this moment, and I needed to confirm it had not sent itself prematurely. It had not. It sat there, patient as stone, subject line reading, transfer of voting trust, final confirmation. 12 seconds. The room began to count down. 140 mouths, all moving in unison. 12, 11, 10. I pressed send. 9, 8, 7. The email departed my outbox at 11:59:57 p.m. 6, 5, 4. It would arrive in 3 inboxes simultaneously. Halvard Quellen at Regulatory Compliance, Britta Osei Asante at the Office of Corporate Governance, and a man named Piero Van Zant, who worked as a silent administrator at the Brannick Family Trust, and who had been, for the past 19 months, working quietly and carefully with me. 3, 2, 1. The room exploded into the new year. Orvin kissed me. It was a real kiss, warm and briefly unguarded, because in that moment he believed the world had just rearranged itself in his favor. He pulled back, looked at me, and smiled the smile of a man who has just become what he always believed he was meant to be. I smiled back. I said, "Happy New Year," and then I put my phone in my clutch and waited. Let me go back, because the ending only makes sense if you understand the beginning. And the beginning is not Orvin. The beginning is me, and what I built before I ever met a Brannick. I was 26 when I walked into the offices of a small actuarial consulting firm in Ghent and sat down across from a man named Dunstan Rive, who told me that what I had done with their client's liability assessment was, and I'm quoting directly, structurally illegal and conceptually brilliant. He meant it as a critique. I took it as a job offer. I was right. By 29, I was running a subsidiary they hadn't known they needed. By 32, I had built, from the framework of that subsidiary, a separate entity called Quellen Thessaly Risk Partners, which handled the kind of regulatory arbitrage that made large companies feel protected and made their lawyers feel nervous in the good way. I met Orvin at a conference in Rotterdam. He was charming in the way that men who have never needed to try very hard are charming, effortlessly, which means thoughtlessly, which means it evaporates the moment the stakes get real. I saw this. I married him anyway because I was not marrying Orvin. I was marrying access to a structure I had spent 3 years studying from the outside. Brannock Vale Holdings was, on paper, a logistics and infrastructure conglomerate. Roads, port facilities, cold chain distribution across 11 countries, 3 subsidiary firms in maritime insurance. In practice, it was a machine for generating regulatory shelter. The kind of company that, because of its scale and geographic spread, sat in a permanent gray zone that governments needed to tolerate. Crispin Brannock had built this deliberately and skillfully. I admired it genuinely. I admired it the way you admire a very old, very complicated lock that someone else made and that you intend to open. The problem, Crispin's problem, though he didn't know it yet, was the voting trust. When Brannock Vale had restructured in 2019, during a hostile acquisition attempt by a Singaporean fund, Crispin had moved 61% of voting shares into a family trust administered by 3 co-trustees, himself, his attorney Gretchen Vale, and a position titled Independent Trustee, which had been vacant since 2021 when the previous holder, a retired magistrate named Teodoro Brix, had died of a stroke in Lisbon. The independent trustee position had never been filled. This was, on Crispin's part, intentional. He didn't want an unknown variable with that much structural power. He'd quietly amended the trust documents to allow the 2 remaining trustees to act jointly in Brix's absence. What he had not considered, what no one had considered because it required simultaneously understanding Belgian trust law, the specific language of a 2017 corporate governance directive, and an obscure precedent from a 2020 Rotterdam arbitration case that most practitioners had filed under interesting but inapplicable, was the following. Under the joint action provision he'd added, the 2 remaining trustees could act. But if one of those trustees held a material undisclosed conflict of interest, which, under the 2017 directive, included any financial relationship with a transaction counterparty initiated within 36 months of the trustee action, then their co-signature was voidable, not void, but voidable, within a specific window, by a third party with standing. Gretchen Vale had, 14 months ago, taken a referral fee from a Croatian logistics firm that Brannock Vale had subsequently acquired. The fee had been disclosed to Crispin privately. It had not been disclosed in the trust's governance filings. Because the acquisition made Brannock Vale the Croatian firm's successor entity, Gretchen technically had a financial relationship with a transaction counterparty of the trust. It was a thread, a very thin one, but I had spent 19 months with Piero Van Zant's help, making sure the thread was real, documented, and positioned correctly. The email I had sent at 11:59:57 p.m. did not undo the transfer Crispin was announcing. It did something more specific. It triggered a voidability review of Gretchen Vale's standing as co-trustee, which meant that any action taken by the trust under her co-signature within the next 72 hours was legally suspended pending a compliance determination by the Corporate Governance Office. The transfer of voting control, the one Crispin had spent tonight announcing, was scheduled to be formalized at 9 a.m. the following morning, via trust documents that Gretchen had already signed. The transfer was suspended, not blocked, not reversed, suspended. And in the suspension, there was a 48-hour window during which the independent trustee position, still vacant, still structurally valid, could be filled by petition of any party with trust standing. I had trust standing. I had acquired it 2 years earlier, before Orvin and I had married, through a consulting agreement with Brannock Vale's maritime insurance subsidiary that included, as a term neither Crispin nor his lawyers had flagged as significant, a provision granting Quellen Thessaly Risk Partners a limited beneficiary interest in exchange for a regulatory risk assessment. The assessment had been exceptional. Crispin himself had said so. The beneficiary interest had never been exercised, until now. At 12:11 a.m., I watched Crispin Brannock's chief of staff, a young man named Fetty Lorbach, who had the particular pallor of someone whose phone had just delivered catastrophic news, cross the ballroom with the practiced urgency of someone trying to look calm while moving very fast. He reached Crispin's ear. I watched Crispin's face. I have seen many faces absorb difficult information. Some collapse inward, some go rigid. Crispin Brannock's face did something I had not fully anticipated. It went absolutely still, like a surface of water the moment before something very heavy strikes it. He turned his head, not toward Orvin, toward Gretchen Vale. Gretchen was already on her phone, fingers moving with the precision of someone who had spent 40 years managing crises and knew exactly how much time she had to manage this one. The answer was, not enough. Orvin appeared at my shoulder. "What's happening?" "I'm not sure," I said. This was technically true. I knew what I had initiated. I didn't know exactly how the next 6 minutes would unfold. Plans are architecture, not choreography. You build the structure. The people inside it move themselves. At 12:17 a.m., Crispin stepped back onto the platform. The room had not fully quieted. There was still laughter in pockets, still the clink of glasses, still the residue of celebration. One of the open bars had just poured a round of sparkling wine that no one was going to finish. The string quartet had moved on to something wistful and unplaceable. Crispin raised his hand. The room quieted again. Same reflex, same obedience, but this time with a different texture. People could feel that something had changed, even if they didn't know what. "I need to make a correction," he said. The word correction landed in the silence like a stone in still water. "The transfer I announced will be delayed." He paused. He was a man who had given thousands of speeches and never once, to my knowledge, searched for words. He was searching now. "There is a procedural matter that requires resolution before the formalization can proceed." Murmuring. The careful social murmuring of people who want to ask questions but understand that this is not the moment. Orvin's hand found mine again. This time, the grip was different. "Thessaly," his voice was very quiet. "Orvin, do you know what this is?" I looked at him, my husband, the man I had married, who was not a bad man, I want to be precise about this, but who had never once in 3 years of marriage asked me a single question about Quellen Thessaly Risk Partners, about what I actually did, about the mechanics of the work that had made me, before I ever met him, independently and substantially wealthy. He had not asked because he had assumed, the way people assume about decorative fixtures, that the answer would be decorative. "I know what it is," I said. His face shifted, something moving behind his eyes that I had not seen before. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to recalibration. "You did this." "I filed a compliance review," I said. "It's procedural, it's entirely legal." "You did this tonight, at midnight." "Timing is part of strategy." He let go of my hand. Across the ballroom, Crispin was stepping down from the platform. He moved through the crowd with the careful navigation of a man who needed to be somewhere else immediately but could not afford to run. His eyes found me across the distance of 140 people and approximately 40 years of certainty about how the world arranged itself. I held his gaze. He was the first to look away. The next 48 hours were, objectively, the most complex administrative period of my professional life, and I have had many complex administrative periods. The Corporate Governance Office's compliance determination came back at 14:32 the following afternoon. Gretchen Vale's co-signature was voidable. The trust action was formally suspended. The independent trustee position was structurally activated. My petition was filed at 14:45. Crispin's legal team filed an objection at 16:02. The objection was technically sound, but procedurally insufficient because the relevant provision had a 48-hour response window, not a same-day window, and the clock on the petition had already started. Piero Van Zant, who had spent 19 months understanding this structure better than anyone alive except me, served as the petition's corroborating administrator. At 9:17 a.m. on the second day of the new year, I was appointed independent trustee of the Brannock Vale Family Trust. I want to be clear about what this meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean I controlled the company. Crispin still held his trustee position. The trust still operated by majority consent on major decisions. What changed was the balance. No longer could Crispin and Gretchen act jointly to exclude the third position. Every significant trust action now required my involvement. I was, in the language of the documents, a co-equal voice. I had not stolen anything. I had not defrauded anyone. I had used, with extraordinary care and precision, the architecture that Crispin himself had built. The vacancy he had left open, the conflict he had allowed to go undisclosed, the beneficiary interest he had granted without reading its full implications, and I had walked through the door that his own structure had left unlocked. He had not seen me. He had looked at me for 3 years and seen Orvin's wife. He had seen the fixture. He had never thought to ask what the fixture knew. 2 weeks later, Crispin Brannock sat across from me at a table in the offices of Brannock Vale Holdings in Antwerp. Just the two of us. He had requested the meeting. I had agreed. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. "How long?" he finally asked. "I started studying the trust structure before Orvin and I were engaged," I said. "The beneficiary interest was structured into the Maritime Consulting Agreement 14 months before the wedding." Something moved across his face that I recognized, because I had seen it in my own face, years earlier, when I first understood the full elegance of what he had built. It was the expression of someone encountering a piece of work they genuinely respect, even as it disadvantages them. "You planned this around a marriage." "I planned around an opportunity," I said. "The marriage was also something I chose. Those two things coexist." "And Orvin?" I thought about how to answer this honestly. Orvin and I had not spoken substantively since the ballroom. He had moved to the guest room of our home and spent his mornings on calls I wasn't part of. We were in a silence that was not hostile but was not comfortable. It was the silence of a man who had spent his life inside a story about himself and had just discovered that the story was missing several chapters he hadn't written. "Orvin will be fine," I said. "He's competent. He always was. He just needed to become competent for reasons other than inheritance." Crispin studied me. "What do you want?" "To do the work," I said. "The actual work. I've spent 3 years watching this company from the outside of a door I was never invited through. I want to be inside. As co-trustee. And eventually as something with a more operational title. But I'm patient. I've demonstrated that." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the Scheldt moved its gray winter water past the old warehouse facades, indifferent to all of us. "You know," he said, "I used to think the most dangerous thing in any negotiation was the person across the table. And now? Now I think it's the person you forgot to put at the table." I did not smile. I simply nodded, the way you nod when someone finally says something you've known for a long time. We shook hands. The company did not collapse. The family did not fracture beyond repair. Orvin, as I had predicted, became more interesting once he had to earn the thing rather than receive it. He and I found our way back to each other through the kind of slow, honest renegotiation that is available only to people who have both stopped pretending. Crispin never fully forgave me, but he respected me. In some configurations of a life, that is the more durable thing. And Gretchen Vale, who had spent 40 years as the most dangerous woman in the room, right up until I walked in, sent me a handwritten note 6 months later. 3 sentences. "I underestimated you. I understand that's not an apology. It's the closest thing to a compliment I know how to give." I kept it. I keep it in the same drawer as my original consulting agreement with the maritime subsidiary, and the trust petition, and a single printed copy of an email sent at 11:59:57 p.m. on the last night of a year that everyone else thought they understood. Not everyone who changes the architecture of a room announces themselves. Some of us just wait for midnight, press send, and let the structure do what structures do when someone finally understands them well enough to ask. If this story stayed with you, like it, subscribe. There are rooms inside every power structure waiting for someone who actually read the blueprints.